Okay, this is a redo on page 8A and B because yesterday's presentation on my part was pretty bad. And we didn't get through very much material because I just got lost since I wasn't reading my notes. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to redo DAF 8A and B, and we're going to go through the entire page, including the material we didn't reach. And those who didn't make it to class can watch this. Those who did can watch it again. Hopefully it'll be a little clearer, and we'll also complete the page so that next week we'll start on 9A. So I'm going to share the page right now. There we go. And we're going to start with this Mishnah here on 7B. And I'm going to try and find the notes for this. Okay. So the Mishnah begins again with a passage based on the formula we saw, because it's not talking about Megillah at this moment. We've moved on because the Mishnah, which was originally intended as an oral document, uses certain formulas to help with memorization. So once we began in Megillah talking about the differences between reading Megillah in a walled city and not in an unwalled city, we continue with that formula. The difference between X and Y is only whatever the issue is. So this one is the difference between Shabbat and Yom Kippur with regard to labor prohibited. Only those days is only in the case that in Shabbat its intentional desecration is punishable at the hand of man. It's by human court. You can get stoned. And in the case of Yom Kippur, intentional desecration of a prohibited labor is punishable by the hand of God, what we call karet. The Gemara makes an assumption that the Mishnah is informing us that since both Shabbat and Yom Kippur entail death penalties, if their sin entails a financial penalty too, he is exempt. So that's the implication from the teaching in the Mishnah by the Gemara. And we're just going to look at the note here. Here. As a rule, one is not liable to receive two punishments for two transgressions violated simultaneously. The principle is one is liable to receive the greater punishment. There's an additional principle that in the case of a prohibition punishable by death, even if the punishment is not implemented due to lack of testimony or forewarning, the mere fact that the prohibition is associated with the stringent punishment exempts one who violated it from any lesser punishment. The dispute here is with regard to karet. Because it is not a punishment administered by the court, perhaps the principles don't apply. But in fact, we're going to find that if that is what the Mishnah is telling us, that the only difference between the two is that if one is punished with, if one acts on prohibited labor on Shabbat, it's a human punishment. Karet, it's divine punishment, which means, according to the Gemara, that if I also did something in which I owe money, damages, in both cases, I don't have to pay the damages. I get, because the more serious punishment applies. The Mishnah seems to be consistent with an opinion of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. Which is that Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana would render Yom Kippur like Shabbat with regard to payment of damages. And we just made the assumption. just as one in the case of one who has intentionally desecrated Shabbat, he's liable to receive the death penalty and is exempt from payment of damages. Tashlumin is the Hebrew word. So on Yom Kippur, he's liable to receive the death penalty and is exempt from tashlumin, damages for desecrating Yom Kippur. In a Mishnah from, now we bring in a Mishnah from Makot. That's another Mishnaic section about, actually mostly about punishments from the court. A person who is guilty of the punishment of karet, but who is punished with lashes, which is a human administered punishment, is exempt from karet. That's the opinion of Rabbi Hananya ben Gamliel. Rabbi Yochanan said that Rabbi Hananya's colleagues disagreed, that he would still be liable to this divine punishment. The reason for the disagreement is that based on our Mishnah, if both the Shabbat infraction and the Yom Kippur infractions are being punished by human administered punishments, then where's the divine punishment? That's what karet is. It undoes the whole point of the Mishnah that we just saw above here, that the difference between Shabbat and Yom Kippur is that Shabbat's desecration of Shabbat is punished by humans, desecration of Yom Kippur punished by divine, is the divine punishment. Very serious punishment. Karet is understood as death of or early death of one's children. So it's pretty serious, but it's obviously not necessarily immediate the way a punishment by humans is. Okay, so that's the issue, is if Makot tells us there's a once the person is punished by human hands, in this case it would be flogged, then he is exempt from karet. Again, only one punishment, and both punishments are severe. Okay, so that's the disagreement. Rav Nachman taught that the opinion opposing Rabbi Hananya ben Gamliel's was actually Rabbi Yitzchak. That, let's see, where is our note here? Okay, I think it's here. Why was karet? No, wait, been too far. Oh, I see. Okay. He's going to bring in a parallel case. This is Rav Nachman bringing in Rabbi Yitzchak's opinion, which will be in conflict with Rabbi Hananya ben Gamliel's. And the note here tells us that there's a principle, a matter that was included in a generalization, but was explicitly excluded in order to teach a halacha, was not excluded to teach only concerning the specific matter at hand. It was rather excluded in order to teach concerning an entire generalization. In other words, an exception written with regard to one detail applies to the entire generalization. So even though, as we see that the general case is incest, is that incest is punished by karet. In Leviticus chapter 20, verse 17, though, one specific case is mentioned that is incest with one's sister. Its specification teaches, according to the rabbinic rules of interpretation, that in fact all cases of incest, those which were mentioned in chapter 18 of Leviticus, which didn't mention the case of sister and brother marriage, that lashes cannot substitute for karet. That's what the extra case is teaching. The second specific case teaches a general rule regarding all cases of incest. Now, Rav Ashi concludes this passage by saying that he concludes the discussion by saying that this, by situating that even if you said the rabbis hold that one can be punished with lashes and karet, they might not disagree with Rabbi Hananya. because they might be saying that the primary punishment for Yom Kippur intentional violations is karet, but if the sinner received lashes, he would then be exempt from karet. So the Mishnah still could hold up here that the difference between Shabbat and Yom Kippur is only that an intentional desecration on Shabbat is punished by human hands. An intentional desecration on Yom Kippur should be a karet, divine punishment. But once the person is given lashes for whatever reason, that takes the place of karet. So the secondary punishment replaces the primary punishment of karet. Okay, new Mishnah. Now we are on to 8a. The Mishnah continues with this formula. The difference between one for whom benefit from another is forbidden by vow, and one for whom benefit from another's food is forbidden by vow, is only with regard to stepping foot onto the property, and with regard to borrowing utensils from him that one does not use in preparation for food, but for other purposes, as those two benefits are prohibited to the former, but permitted to the latter. Okay. The focus here is on a person who makes a vow not to benefit from another person, and a vow not to benefit from another's food. Now, making vows was a serious business in biblical and rabbinic periods. It had religious sanction. We have an entire tractate in the Mishnah about the rules of making vows and the exacting language required. And there's even a second one about the specific vow taken by a Nazir. That's the person who vows not to cut his hair or drink any wine or any grape beverage for a period of time. There are two types of vows. There are nidre hekdesh, that is dedication, vows that to bring an offering to the temple, and there are nidre isar. Lasor is to deprive oneself of something, vows of deprivation, in which the votary pledges not to do something or to benefit from something. Vows had to be made voluntarily and with proper intention. By the Talmudic period, it was very much discouraged. If one wished to undo the vow, it could only be annulled by a court of three. People would sometimes make a vow of deprivation. Why? Why would you even do such a thing? To force yourself to make a bad habit, right? It's better than making a promise that a New Year's Eve pledge that you're gonna, go exercise, or you're not going to eat fatty foods. I don't know. This would, by taking a vow, which was very serious business, it would hopefully encourage the person to change the bad habit. Because if you break a vow, that's significant. In this Mishnah, we learn that the difference between a person making a vow not to benefit from another and a person making a vow not to benefit from the food of another is only in regard to stepping onto the property of the person from whom one vows not to derive benefit, and the use of the utensils used to prepare food. If one vows to benefit from another's food, one can still borrow utensils, like of various kinds, and can still walk onto another's property. So the Gemara opens by clarifying what kinds of utensils one may not benefit from. The Gemara infers that with regard to the matter of utensils that one uses in preparation of food, both the one who vowed that any benefit is forbidden, and that one who vowed that benefit from food is forbidden are equal. So both these cases, one cannot borrow, your KitchenAid. Now, in the case of the Gemara, let's look at the halacha. Vows and offering. What is the difference between a vow offering and a gift offering? If one designated Oh, sorry, that's the wrong halacha. Regarding this is one prohibited by vow from deriving benefit from another, and one prohibited by vow from deriving benefit from another's food. One for whom it is prohibited to derive benefit from another's possessions is prohibited to pass through his friend's property, even if it does not shorten his path. He may not even go through his friend's fields during the summer, when people typically overlook trespassing in their fields. Likewise, he may not borrow any vessel from his friend. If he is prohibited by vow from deriving benefit from another's food, it is prohibited to eat your fellow's food. If one said benefit from your food is prohibited for me, he may not eat the food. However, he may use vessels used in the preparation of food. If he said benefit that leads to food is prohibited for me, he may neither eat the food nor benefit from any vessel that is typically rented. Okay, so here, the later halacha is making a distinction by the use of language and how you make the vow to not benefit from food. Let's see the conclusion here of this Gemara. The Mishnah stated that for one for whom benefit from another is forbidden by vow, stepping on the latter's property is prohibited. In the case of stepping onto another's property, the question is that really a benefit? For in the case of a property owner, most people aren't particular if somebody walks on their property to make a shortcut. So the question is the votary really denying himself from that? Since that's not really, is that really a benefit that he gets from his friend or his neighbor? Rava's answer is that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the author of this opinion, benefits that are overlooked, that is not taken too seriously by others, are also denied to the votary who abstains from all benefits of others. All right. Next Mishnah. This one states the difference between animals consecrated to the temple as vow offerings and animals consecrated as gift offerings is only that in the case of vow offerings, if they died or were lost before being sacrificed on the altar, one is obligated in the responsibility to replace them. And in the case of gift offerings, if they died or were lost, one is not obligated in the responsibility to replace them. Let's go look over here at the note. What's the difference between a vow offering and a gift offering in the halachic notes? If one designated an animal for an offering by means of a vow, and the animal was lost or died, he's obligated to replace it. If one designated an animal as a gift offering, saying this is an offering, if the animal dies or lost, he is not obligated to replace it. So if you just say, if you designate an animal for the offering, according to the halacha, you've got to replace it if it dies before you can bring it to the temple. But if you just designate an animal for a gift offering, just saying this is an offering, you haven't specified exactly what you're doing, you're just kind of giving an offering, then you're not, then if that particular animal dies, you're not obligated to replace it. Let's go down to the notes here. Okay. Oh, that note is not important. Okay. The Gemara. The Gemara now, first the Gemara states that regarding to when either pledge is made, they are both subjected to the same time requirement for it to be filled. When you make a vow, you have to, there's a certain limited time commitment that you have to make good on your vow. And the background here tells us that the source for this prohibition, bal te'acher, don't delay, is Deuteronomy chapter 23, 22. One violates the prohibition when he fails to fulfill his commitment before 3 pilgrim festivals pass from the time it was pledged. So if you made your pledge in August, which is before Sukkot, that's the next festival, you would have to fulfill the pledge by Sukkot, Pesach, and then Shavuot. You'd have to make it by the time Shavuot comes around, which would be sometime in the spring. If you made it if you made it in February, which is right before Passover, you would have to fulfill it before, what do we say, 3 months, before 3 pilgrimages pass. So you'd have to fulfill it before that fall when Sukkot comes. The prohibition applies to all obligatory offerings, tithes, gifts, and pledges to the temple treasury. Moreover, this prohibition also applies to pledges to charity and the like, which must also be honored within the same period of time. So for us today, if it would be good for us when we make a pledge, if we say, to the Federation, I'm going to pledge, $500, $1,000 to Federation, make it good before those 3 holidays are up in a timely fashion. Same thing with dues to a synagogue. One should make if you pledge the entire amount, I mean, here, Sinai Synagogue, you can make it monthly, but you've got to start making good on that pledge before the 3 festivals take place. Okay. We continue. The difference in the Mishnah has to do with the language of a neder, that is a vow. In a neder, one says, it is incumbent upon me, thus making the votary responsible for bringing the offering or its replacement. But in a nidava, this voluntary offering, one says this animal is to be an offering. If something happens to that particular animal, one is exempt from replacing it. Now, there's a mistake in Steinsaltz's translation here. It got a little confusing. Minahani Mile, where does we derive these rules from, these ideas? The Tanan Rabbanan, v'nirtzalo lechaper Allah, it comes from a very beginning of the book of Leviticus. It shall be accepted for him to make atonement upon him. To make atonement on a gift that you've offered, you got to do it in timely fashion. Now, Rabbi Shimon says, that which is incumbent upon him, et she'alav chayav be'achrayuto, that which is incumbent upon him, that is, which he accepted as a personal obligation, he does. Cross out the word not. I don't know how it got in there, except that because the next passage has the same verse, same wording. He does bear responsibility. It says right here, she'alav chayav, he is chayav, obligated, be'achrayuto. However, ve'et she'eino alav, that which is not incumbent upon him, he didn't accept it as a personal obligation when he designated that offering. He just said he was making an offering. Here's this offering. He didn't say it's incumbent upon me. Specifically, that language, he does not bear responsibility if he didn't use that specific language. All right. Now, okay, so, and the Gemara just continues, but Rabbi Yitzchak Avdimi says, since he's made the burden upon his own shoulders, he has to fulfill that responsibility, even if the animal were to die. Okay, now I said in my notes that we're getting into areas which are really, traditionally they make my eyes droop when I study the Talmud and we get into these issues, because it doesn't have any reality to our lives. So it's kind of hard to get to make sense of it. Cases of Zav, these gonorrheic emissions, or any kind of blood purity issues, anything having to do with skin disease, tzara'at. Nevertheless, I think it's also fair to say that in some sense, that's the purest Talmudic study you can do, because it's completely lishma. You wouldn't be studying except for the fact that it's Talmud. You're not learning any practical rules from it, not even metaphorically, I don't think. Okay, so but let's, and plus we've been studying, we thought this was about Megillah, and there's nothing about the Purim or Megillah here. So, but we'll get back to Megillah eventually. First, we have a few more Mishnayot. All right, so here's the Mishnah. Oh, and some basic information before we get to the Mishnah. A Zav is a male who experiences what today we assume is a gonorrheal emission, similar to a seminal emission. It's discussed in chapter 15 of Leviticus. A Zav with one emission is in a state of ritual impurity to the first degree, meaning he can transmit ritual impurity to food and drink, but not people. So you have this emission, it shakes hands with somebody, the person you shook hands with will not be in a state of tuma, impurity. However, if you touch food, then anybody who touches the food can gain a certain level of ritual impurity if they touch the food. Now, if he has two emissions, then he's considered a primary source of impurity, what we call av hatuma, which is similar to touching a dead body. You can then transmit impurity to other people. And one who's in this state can transmit impurity to anything that he sits or lies on. He can only become ritually pure. He can only become pure after when he's in this state of two emissions, after 7 clean days, and then he has to go to a mikvah. The difference between a 2 emission zav and a 3 emission zav is the basis of this next Mishnah. The Mishnah says the key distinction is that a 3 emission zav brings a sacrifice, implying that there's no difference with regard to lying on cushions or counting 7 clean days before the mikvah, which is what this is what the Gemara gathers from the implication here. Ein bein zav haroeh shtei re'iyot, no difference between a zav who sees 2 emissions, l'roeh shalosh, who sees 3 emissions, except for this korban. So 7 days of waiting, quarantine, and no emissions, and and transmitting impurity to anything you lie on or sit on, they're the same, in a 2 or a 3 zav emission. So where do we learn this? Rav Simai offers that since there is a verse in which the zav is mentioned twice, and one in which his status is mentioned 3 times, the significance must be that in both cases he is impure. But the extra use of the word zov in Leviticus chapter 15, verse 3, teaches us that he must do something in addition to 7 days of 7 days of waiting while one is clean, and the fact that they can transmit impurity to lying and sitting on surfaces. That addition is you got to bring an offering. Now the Gemara wonders if this has to be the interpretation of the difference between 2 and 3, and they discuss back and forth. Eventually, they determine that the language, let's come down here, that the language in chapter 15, verse 15, that the Kohen shall provide him atonement before God from his emission, mizovo, is the language of limitation. The preposition mi can mean a number of things, but one thing that halachically they're learning is that it limits the cases. the situations. That is, it is limiting some cases in which a Zav would bring an offering. In some cases, as when he has 2 emissions, he does not. But if a person has 3 emissions in a row, he has to bring an offering. It then adds that you need both teachings. You need Rav Simai's interpretation and the Baraita that came before its interpretation together to make sense of the difference between 2 and 3 emissions. Here is where it states the Gemara comments, it was necessary. Itztarich de Rabbi Simai, the itztarich mizovo, you need the 2. And if the difference between 2 and 3 emissions had it only been derived from the statement of Rabbi Simai, that is, Rabbi Simai, that the mentioning of Zav twice in verse Leviticus 15, verse 2, and 3 times in verse 3, I would have said in accordance with our question, perhaps one who experiences 2 emissions brings an offering, and one who experiences 3 emissions is impure and brings an offering. They both bring an offering. Therefore, it teaches us from his emission, this limitation in the word mizovo, this limiting term of the preposition min. And if the difference between 2 and 3 emissions was derived from the term mizovo, I would not have known how many emissions render him liable to bring an offering, and only that some from the status of Zav are not required to bring an offering. Therefore, it teaches us the proof cited by Rabbi Simai, that 2 has the person is in a state of impurity and must wait 7 days, but 3 emissions, he also has to bring an offering. Okay, continuing on. But another verse regarding the Zav in verse 13 in chapter 15 of Leviticus states, and when the Zav is cleaned from his emission, we've got another use of the word mizovo. What can we learn from this limiting phrase? Or if you've told me that mizovo limits situations, what's the limitation here? In this case, it would be that if a person was a Zav and had tzara'at, which is this skin disease, which Steinsaltz translates as leprosy, which is really not an appropriate translation. It is just an unusual disease. It doesn't have the symptomology of what we call leprosy, which is Hansen's disease. It's some strange skin disease called tzara'at. If the person had was a Zav, and he also had this tzara'at skin disease, he can still count his 7 days clean and does not need to wait until the tzara'at is over. However, he will not be completely ritually pure until after his tzara'at clears. But after 7 clean days from his being in a state of Zav, being a Zav, or Zav emissions, his last Zav emission, he will not transmit impurity to anything he sits on. Now, the question then is, well, couldn't we have figured that out logically? Once he has 2 emissions, isn't it obvious that besides conveying impurity to what he sits on, he would also need to count 7 clean days? As it says here, if a Zav has experienced 2 emissions, renders a surface designated for lying and a surface designated for sitting ritually impure, and all strictures of a Zav apply to him, wouldn't he require also a count of 7 clean days to become purified? So why did you need to bring in the whole tzara'at deal? So they bring in another case where a person is, or in this case, a woman is in a state of impurity. Because she is in the midst of, and a woman is in a state of nidah, ritual impurity, when her menstrual cycle is involved. But there are cases where during the clean period, let's read the notes here. If it tells us about, gives us some details. Okay, so it doesn't give us any information here. But what happens is that when a woman is in her menstrual period, after the bleeding ends, she counts another 7 clean days. Where she doesn't bleed, and then she is in a state of ritual purity, which is most importantly. Then she goes to the mikvah, and then when she's in this state of ritual purity, she and her husband can engage in sexual relations. What happens if during this period, when she should be fine for sexual relations, she bleeds for a day? Does she have to go back and start all over again, counting the 7 clean days, so waiting for it to stop bleeding 7 clean days? So that's the case here. And what that case is called is Shomeret Yom Keneged Yom. A lesser zava, there I'm looking at the halacha notes, who observes a clean day for 1 or 2 days of discharge, also renders vessels impure through contact. So she's in this state of ritual impurity, and were she to touch something, she would render the vessel impure. And she transmits ritual impurity to a surface designated for lying or designated for sitting, right? A chair, rendering them a primary source of ritual impurity. So during this short period, these 1 or 2 days of the discharge, she is in she can render things impure. All right. This refers to a woman who experienced 1 or 2 days of bleeding not during her menstrual period and is required to wait 1 day without any further discharge of blood before immersion in a ritual bath. Now, this is significant, says the Gemara, because she renders surfaces impure, but she doesn't have to count 7 days. So here, as I was explaining, there's a 7-day, the 11-day span between a woman's menstrual periods during which a discharge of blood could render her a zava. This comes from chapter 15, verse 25 in Leviticus. If she should see a discharge during these 11 days, it is not that she returns to being in a state of complete nidah and has to wait 7 clean days. Rather, she checks each day to see if there's discharge. After 1 clean day, she goes to the mikvah, and then she's in a state of ritual purity. If she were to see a discharge of 3 days in a row, then she would have to wait another 7 clean days before going to the mikvah. In any case, since we have a situation in which a person sees a discharge but does not have to count 7 clean days, this is an example of a case like that. Here too, one might think that the zav might also not have to wait 7 clean days. But because the text states mizovo, the lesson is that it teaches that in some cases of emissions, they do require 7 clean days. In this case, 2 emissions require waiting 7 clean days. Rav Papa asks Abaye, what's the difference between reading the phrase mizovo as inclusive, right? You've now included 2 emissions as well as 3 emissions as counting 7 clean days, and the case of mizovo, which was exclusive, our case in which the zav of 2 emissions does not have to bring. He excludes him bringing an offering. And Abaye's answer is basically that in each case, the text could have simply foregone the use of the term mizovo, but by using the extraneous phrase, it teaches both of these conditions. So using mizovo teaches us a new halakha, in a different case. All right, here we go to the mission that we missed on this past Sunday. Ein bein mitzora musgar. Oh, maybe we did do this one. Ein bein mitzora musgar le mitzor muchlat ela priya ufrima. Oh no, we never got to the Gemara. Okay, so here's the Mishnah. The difference between a quarantined leper, which is really quarantined mitzora person with mitzora, with sara'at. Steinsaltz informs us it's one examined by a priest who found his symptoms to be inconclusive and must therefore remain in isolation for a period of up to 2 weeks, waiting to see if conclusive symptoms develop. And a confirmed mitzora, person with tzara'at, one whose symptoms were definitely conclusive, the priest declared him to be absolutely a mitzora, a person with this tzara'at disease. The only difference between these two cases, one he's waiting, he's in quarantine, and one who is definitely considered to be mitzora, is about letting the hair grow on one's head, wild, and rending one's garment. That is, a person who definitely has mitzora'at and has been removed from the community, doesn't cut one's hair, and does tear one's garment. Okay, so let's do a little bit of information here. Steinsaltz I told you that Steinsaltz refers to the person as a leper. It's really a misnomer. No one really knows what the disease was, except that it affected the skin in such a way that Jacob Milgram, who's a biblical scholar, suggested the person looked like their body was dying. And they can compare, and so the rules in the Bible compare a person with tzora'at to be like a dead body. You can transmit highest level of impurity if a person is a mitzora. The disease is called tzara'at in the Bible. Such an individual, when suffering from this disease, was evaluated by a Kohen. If some symptoms were present, but others were lacking, the mitzora was isolated for 7 days and then reevaluated again. Such an individual is a quarantined or a confined mitzora. If at this time, after the quarantine, which Steinsaltz said was 2 weeks, if after this period of confinement, the Kohen finds the condition was continued, and it's a case of definite tzara'at, the Kohen confirms this, and the person is referred to as a confirmed mitzora. And we noted the difference, according to the Mishnah, what the difference is. Now, a difference between the second half of the Mishnah, ein bein tahor mitoch hesger letahor mitoch hechleit ela tigla'at v'tziporim, the difference between a mitzora who's been purified from a state of quarantine, right? He was never considered, oh, you've got a confirmed case. You were in this quarantine case, you were watching it. And a case of confirmation is that only the confirmed mitzora, when he finally is healed, to achieve a state of purity, he's obligated he has a ritual in which he's obligated to shave all the hair on his body, head and body, and observe the ritual of what we call the birds. Let's look at the notes here. The halakha says the halachot of a quarantined leper and a confirmed leper are equal with regard to their impurity. However, the quarantined leper is not obligated, I keep using the word leper when I shouldn't, the quarantined mitzora is not obligated to let his hair grow wild and rend his garments. The only difference between the purification process of a quarantined mitzora and a confirmed mitzora is that the confirmed mitzora must shave his hair on his entire body and bring the birds. Now let's see if we can get some information about this. The halachot of a mitzora, which is detailed in chapters 13 and 14 of Leviticus, and in a Mishnaic tractate known as Nigaim. Essentially, one detects a leprous lesion on his skin and goes to the priest, who quarantines him for 7 days. If the lesion has grown darker, then he's purified. That's a good thing. If it has not, he is quarantined for an additional 7 days. If the lesion did not grow, then he is stayed pure. If it's spread though on his skin, he is called a confirmed mitzora. The impurity of the leper is quite severe. Not only is it prohibited for him to enter places that are sacred, it's also prohibited for him to enter walled cities, and he must remain outside the three camps. The three camps being the temple, the sacred area where the priests go, the area where the Levites go, the wider area, and the place where the Israelites are living. He renders items ritually impure through contact, through lifting. He renders impure the contents of a house that he enters. When the lesion heals, the leper brings 2 birds, a cedar branch, and a hyssop, and they slaughter one of the birds and sprinkle its blood. Then the leper shaves all the hair on his body, and on the 8th day, he brings a special purification offering. So you can see it really is just like a dead body. Just as if a dead body is in a house, everybody who walks into that house is rendered impure. So too, if a leper walks into the house, and that's how Milgram, that's how he sees it, as that the disease makes you look like you are dying or you're dead because of the skin lesions all over your body. And that was the comparison for ancient Israel. Okay, so that's the implication here as we begin the Gemara. Hala inyan shiluach vituma zeh. The Gemara infers that with regard to the matter of expulsion from all the camps and the encampment of the Israelites in the desert and from walled cities in Eretz Israel, and the ritual impurity level, both the confined mitzvah and the confirmed mitzvah are equal. All right. Menahanimu, where do we get this idea? There's a verse. On the 7th day, the priest shall examine him again. If the affection has faded and is not spread on the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. If it is a rash, and he shall wash his clothes, and he shall be clean. The term "he shall be clean" is taher, but it's written in the past tense. The understanding is that the quarantined mitzorah was considered at some level clean from the start of the process, and thus not required to let his hair grow and rend his garments. Of course, he was considered to be impure during the period of time in regard to exile and causing impurity to the things he touched. Now, Rava points out, get down here to Rava. Rava points out that the term on which Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak learns this, the use of the term taher, means something different in the case of the Zav. There, it means that if the Zav finished his 7-day clean period and subsequently has another emission, anything he moved, right, because we said ritual impurity, one of the effects of Zav, we didn't say this, but one of the effects of Zav is that he transfers ritual impurity to moving an earthenware object. So anything he moved during the 7-day clean period, when he was declared after he was declared pure, and the next emission is not retroactively considered impure. So again, the Zav finishes his 7-day clean period, and then he has another emission. If he touched anything during the 7 days, after he was declared pure, state of purity, and so after those 7 days, and then he's in a state of purity, then he has another emission. Anything that he touched during that middle period is not considered retroactively impure. It wasn't like, oops, we goofed. He really wasn't in a state of purity, and anything he touched after we incorrectly declared him ritually pure is now impure. No, he's not retroactively, anything he touched is not retroactively considered impure. Though other aspects of his impurity are declared impure retroactively, like a seat cushion he may have sat on. So here too, it must mean the term taher in the past tense, that aspects of ritual impurity would be would not be considered impure retroactively. Rather, Rava learns this halacha from here. As for the person with a tzara'at affection, his clothes shall be rent, his head shall be left bare, and he shall cover over his upper lip, and he shall call out, unclean, unclean. The person in whom there is a tzara'at affection, the Metzora is one who has it on his body, not one to whom he is uncertain and is in a state of waiting out the 7-day period. It's kind of like, as I mentioned in the notes, that it's like the person who has COVID and the person who has to wait for days for the testing facility to tell him yes or no on his COVID test. Now, in both cases, the person is quarantined, right? You're waiting to find out. At the beginning of the COVID, it was, you could wait for 7 days to 2 weeks where you didn't actually have COVID, but you didn't know. So you were quarantined. And one is only declared to have COVID, only the one who is declared to have COVID has to start calling his friends and to quarantine themselves. Oh, I see. Here was the in whom. So let's go back to the leper in the Metzora in whom the plague is, his clothes shall be rent and the hair of his head shall grow wild, indicating that only one whose tzara'at is dependent on the state of his body, in whom the plague is obligated to let his hair grow wild and to rend garments. This excludes the Metzora, whose tzara'at is not dependent solely on the state of his body, but rather on the passage of days that he's waiting to finish the quarantine. Abai says to him, but if that's so, then also with regard to the verse, another verse, all the days during which the plague shall be in him, he shall be impure. Say that one who has tzara'at is dependent on the state of, one whose tzara'at is dependent on the state of his body requires expulsion from the camp, and one whose tzara'at is not dependent solely on the state of his body does not require expulsion. Maybe, why are we expelling this person while he's in quarantine? So Abai's question here revolves around language, that because the next verse has the phrase bo, in him, and there it speaks of exile. So shouldn't the confined Metzora not be subject to expulsion as well? But then the Gemara just taught us that the confined and the confirmed Metzora are both subject to expulsion. Rava's response to him is that the language in the next verse, verse 46, chapter 13, where it says, Kol yamei asher hanega bo yitma, all the days during which the plague shall be in him, he shall be impure. Say that one whose leprosy is dependent on the state of his body, you can see the lesions, requires expulsion. Oh, darn, I lost my place. From the camp, and one whose leprosy is not dependent. Wait, shoot. Let me go back here. Wait, 13, we had, yeah, right, we were looking at this. Kol yamei, that's the verse. Kol yamei asher hanega bo yitma. All the days during which the plague shall be in him, he shall be impure. So Rava understands this term for kol yamei to be significant. Yamei, kol yamei, l'rabot mitzora musgar l'shiloach. Rava said to him, there's a difference source for the obligation to expel the quarantine leper from the quarantine mitzora from the camp. The verse could have stated the days during which the plague shall be upon him. Instead, the verse said all the days. That includes the person, the confined, the quarantine mitzora, as well as the confirmed. So that person's in a state. All the days teaches that it's inclusive of both types of the mitzora. So both of them have to be expelled from the community. So why shouldn't the quarantine mitzora, let's go a little farther here. Why shouldn't the quarantine mitzora also have to shave off his hair and observe the bird ritual when his confinement is over? That's the next question. Abai points out a different verse from Leviticus chapter 14. The priest shall go out of the camp. V'yatzah hakohen el michutz lemachaneh. V'hine nirpa nega hatzara'at. And behold, if the plague of the tzara'at is healed in the mitzora. Then the purification process that includes shaving and bringing birds begins. This indicates that these halachot apply to a confirmed mitzora, whose leprosy is dependent on healing. That excludes the leper whose leprosy is not dependent solely on healing, but rather on the passage of days, meaning he never really had confirmed tzara'at. He was in this state of in-between, inconclusive. In the notes, it tells us in the Jerusalem Talmud, it's derived from the language of the verse. This shall be the law of the leper on the day of his purity. The obligation to bring an offering is incumbent upon a leper who is purified in one day, one who is healed of his leprosy. A quarantine leper must wait, quarantine mitzora, must wait 7 days, even if the lesion heals before the conclusion of that period. So just again to go through the notes, Abai points out to a different verse that the priest shall go outside the camp if the priest sees that the mitzora has been healed of his scaly affection. Has been healed implies the person had to be healed from tzara'at. That was not the case with the confined, the quarantined mitzora, who was never declared to have a specific case. All right. Next Mishnah. Ein bein sfarim letfilin umezuzot, ela shahasfarim nichtavin bechol lashon, utfilin umezuzot einan nichtavot ela ashurit. New situation that we're talking about. No more about skin diseases or emissions, but we're talking about something that actually does have relation to us today. The difference between Torah scrolls and tefillin and mezuzot, in terms of how they're written, is only that Torah scrolls are written in any language, whereas tefillin and mezuzot are written in Ashurit, in Hebrew, using the Hebrew script. Now let's look at some of these notes here. First, the background. Ashurit, the Hebrew script that we use today, and you see this on the top here in this picture, where it says Rehov ben Amram, right above the English. That is written in what we call Ashurit, even though it gets confusing because we say, oh, that's Hebrew. Well, it's actually technically called Ashurit script. Ancient Hebrew script, which is on the bottom of the 3 lines there in the picture, was used by Samaritans and still used by the Samaritans. The sages disagreed as to why the script is called Ashurit. Some explain that it is because the Jews brought it with them when they returned from Ashur, which was Babylonian and Assyria. Others explain that it is from the word happiness, osher, or directness, yosher, meaning an aesthetic, straightforward script. The ancient Hebrew script is still used by Samaritans today, and there you see it in the image of on the street sign. So when it says here that tefillin and mezuzot have to be written in Ashurit, it means the Hebrew that we're familiar with. Now let's see the note up here. Later authorities comment that there are many additional differences, between the laws of writing tefillin and laws of writing a Torah scroll. But the Rashba and Ritva, 2 commentators, explain that despite the phrasing of the Mishnah, it does not presume to enumerate all the differences. Um, okay, so when it says that we're talking about Torah scrolls, we're talking about the sanctity of the Torah scrolls or the sanctity of tefillin and mezuzot. Torah scrolls have a certain level of sanctity according to this Mishnah, even in whatever language they're written in. Whereas tefillin and mezuzot, if you wrote them in some other script, they're not considered sacred. Now, Shimon ben Gamliel adds the Mishnah, Af basfarim lo hitiru sheyikatvu ela yivanit. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, even with regard to Torah scrolls, the sages permitted them to be written only in Greek. So Torah scrolls, you got two choices: Hebrew, Ashurit, and Greek. This is according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. But tefillin and mezuzot must be written in Ashurit. The Gemara continues, again, by drawing an implication. The implication being that the Torah scroll and tefillin render the hands unclean, that is, the texts are sacred, and that the stitching of each Torah scroll and tefillin must be with sinews, not with string, a regular string. It's got to be with the sinews of animals. A contradiction is raised from the Baraita, from a Baraita, that if a Hebrew verse in the Torah is written in Aramaic, or an Aramaic translation was written in Hebrew, and anything was written in Ivrit, which is that ancient Hebrew script that the Samaritans still use, not what we use today called Ashurit, it no longer renders the hands impure. It is not sacred. How can Torah scrolls be written in other languages? So let's read the Torah text, the text here. And the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Baraita. A Torah scroll containing a Hebrew verse in the Bible that one wrote in Aramaic translation. And the note here says, the scroll on which an Aramaic verse is written in Hebrew, or a Hebrew verse that is written in Aramaic, or a verse that is written in ancient Hebrew script, does not render the hands impure. So you got to write the scroll in that. In the Hebrew scroll has to be written in Hebrew, Aramaic, not in Aramaic translation, for it to be considered sacred. Where were we? A Torah scroll containing a Hebrew verse in the Bible that one wrote in Aramaic translation, or a verse written in Aramaic translation that one wrote in the Hebrew of the Bible, or that was written in the ancient Hebrew script and not in Ashurit, it renders the hands impure only if one writes it in Ashurit script, on a parchment scroll and in ink. Apparently, contrary to the Mishnah, scroll written in a language other than Hebrew is not sacred. How can Torah be written in other languages? If, according to the Baraita, you got to write it in Ashurit. So Rava says it's not. This isn't a difficulty because we're talking about two different cases. We're going to go into the top of 9a. Kan bigufan shalanu, kan bigufan shalahen. The Mishnah is referring to Torah scrolls written in another language, but in our Hebrew script. This is what used to be done. This is not so unusual. There are texts that are written in Judeo Spanish, Judeo-Arabic, that the language is in, well, even Yiddish is written in Hebrew script, but it's in the foreign language. So the Mishnah is referring to Torah scrolls written in another language, but that are written with Hebrew script. The Baraita, which says, oh, no, you got to write it in Ashurit, is referring to scrolls written in another language in their script. That would not be holy. If you wrote a Torah scroll in Cyrillic letters or in English, it wouldn't be considered sacred. But if you wrote, according to the Mishnah, if you wrote a text in Yiddish or in Judeo-Arabic using Hebrew letters, it would have sanctity to it. Okay, and that's what we'll leave off, and that's what we're going to start up next Sunday with 9a. Looking forward to seeing you then.